My household recently went through a 3-week bout of viral disruption. A week home from school for my 7-year-old, which then tagged me with her initial cold. And then when she was feeling better, I got hit with a slow healing sinus infection, and my husband got knocked out by a more intense version of her initial cold and cough, followed by a surprise last-minute stomach flu for my daughter. And even after she was back in school, as the days of brain fog dragged on from the tail end of this sinus infection for me, I had a ton of trouble focusing on all the work I'd planned to focus on. That first week of disruption rolled into a second week, and then the second unexpectedly dragged into a third, where I was just foggy-headed and fatigued and was having trouble moving through days in a normal way. And years ago, when something like this happened, I likely would have internally berated myself for not being tough enough to push through and get that work done anyway. I would almost certainly have added salt in the wound of not feeling good by telling myself I was being too sensitive or imagining these symptoms or just being lazy. I would almost certainly have tried to force myself to push through, despite my system giving the clear feedback that it was just needing a little more rest and recovery time. My internal reflexive response up through my late 20s was generally one of internal harshness and self-blame. My inner response when things got tough tended to be cold and distanced and pushy and judgmental and critical toward myself. But this time, my mind let me glide pretty placidly through these turbulent few weeks. It was annoying and painful to be feeling under the weather and not able to get normal things done and work things done, for sure. But my inner narrative didn't add a bunch of salt into that wound in the form of resistance or self-blame. My default internal response was more like, this is a drag that this is happening, but we've had such a healthy year. We were due for a viral cycle. This is a normal thing that happens sometimes with a little kid. We'll just ride this out. It is really okay. It felt unfun to go through, pain, but my system wasn't layering a bunch of unnecessary resistance or shoulds, suffering, on top of it. My inner terrain was pretty warm and caring and self-supportive, a pretty soft space to hang out as I moved through the unpleasantness of this experience. And there was a basic acceptance that this was what was happening. There weren't a bunch of voices in my head trying to hack my way around the situation or tell me we shouldn't be here. My default inner response was mostly to help myself feel as soothed and supported as possible as I moved through this normal human bummer of a thing that sometimes happens to us all. So what allowed for such a dramatically different internal response from those old days I mentioned to now? Lots of years and lots of minutes and hours of self-compassion and loving kindness practice. But honestly, I used to be a huge cynic about this stuff. I remember on my first ever silent meditation retreat back in 2006, I literally would get up and leave the meditation hall to go get a snack in the dining hall when these heart-centered practices were being taught. My mind absolutely dismissed these practices as woo-woo and soft and too simple to possibly be effective. The reality was my inner cynic was trying to protect my vulnerable places from having light shined onto them. But of course I didn't know that at the time. And that's the paradoxical thing about self-compassion. In order for warmth and care to be let in toward ourselves, the painful, shadowy corners of unaddressed suffering within us have to first be acknowledged. We can't care for a part of ourselves that we're unaware is hurting. We have to see the suffering with clear eyes before we can appropriately tend to it. And that can feel incredibly scary and vulnerable, terrifying, in fact, to the parts of us that have been trying to prevent those vulnerable, shamey spots from ever being brought into the light of day, for fear that if they were, our fears of being unlovable or defective or irredeemable would be proven true. So over the past 25 years or so on this spiritual and personal development path, for me, I have found self-compassion practice to be probably the most personally transformative. It has truly transformed my brain and my way of being in the world. I honestly feel like a completely different person walking around the planet than I did as that self-critical 25-year-old, as this practice has rewired my brain and my nervous system over time. So let's pause for a few minutes to define what self-compassion actually is, since there's often a misconception that it's some sappy, amorphous self-love thing, which can trigger some real aversive ick in most of us. I know it absolutely used to for me. No, self-compassion is fundamentally about treating ourselves with kindness simply because we're human and so are inherently worthy of care and respect. It's about being as caring and supportive a friend to ourselves as we would be to a good friend in our life. With self-compassion, we're acknowledging our own normal human suffering when it arises, and we're turning toward it with warmth, curiosity, care, understanding, rather than with judgment or a covert agenda to fix a perceived problem away. With self-compassion, we're meeting and being with our own suffering, whether that's a major life blow or a more minor daily annoyance that parts of us are accustomed to minimizing or dismissing as things that don't really count as suffering. Meeting ourselves in a way that allows us to feel truly seen and understood and held in a challenging moment. And with self-compassion, our self-worth is not contingent on how good or smart or perfect or successful or attractive or popular we think we're perceived to be from the outside. With self-compassion, we're becoming our own secure attachment base, our own safe, reliable, steady center we know we can come home to and be welcomed home with open arms into anywhere, anytime. We know that no matter how we're showing up out there, we'll be warmly welcomed in here. And interestingly and somewhat paradoxically, the first step with self-compassion is to fully acknowledge and accept the reality of moments in which we're struggling or suffering. Because again, we can't extend care toward our wounded, hurting parts until we're honestly aware that those parts are hurting. But there are some misconceptions about self-compassion that often get in our way of even starting, much less leaning into the practice in a sustained and potentially transformative way. The first of those is the belief that if we started being kind to ourselves, we'll stop being productive or drop all our ambitions. The fear that we'll become slothful, lazy, unmotivated if we stop harshly pushing ourselves forward. The second is the fear that being kinder to ourselves will make us selfish, self-indulgent, or keep us stuck in indulging self-pity. The third is perfectionism, a fear of turning toward our perceived failures because of an overwhelming sense of shame that if we look directly at something that we feel we've gotten wrong in our lives, it will prove our worst fears about ourselves to be true. And then there's also often an initial backdraft as we begin to defrost these long frozen or unaerated parts of ourselves. So paradoxically, when we first open the door, even a crack, a sliver to let in a bit of fresh oxygen of warmth and genuine care toward ourselves, at first it may really feel the opposite of good. That initial wave of compassion might stir up our cynical and resistant protective inner parts because it just feels so different than what we're used to and so different from what these parts have believed is and isn't safe for us. And then most of us have unconsciously fortified a strong inner critic within us for years, whose intended role has been to drive us forward, to motivate us to strive for excellence and success. So there's often a deep identity-based fear that we would just flounder in our lives if we stopped beating ourselves up in order to get things done. We just don't know what it's like without that. But with thousands of research studies on self-compassion out there these days, it's being proven again and again that actually a strong foundation of self-compassion leads to higher motivation and striving for higher personal standards than being driven by our inner critic does. Coming from a strong foundation of self-compassion actually leads to more willingness to make bold choices and try new things, not less, because we trust that we've got ourselves internally. When we trust that we have a safe, steady, loving, secure home base to return to within ourselves, that's going to meet and hold us with care and kindness and respect, even when we make a mistake, even when we fail, rather than berate or judge us the way our inner critic tries to motivate us, then we're willing to take more chances in our lives, to step toward our deepest desires, our bigger callings. And since self-compassion is about neither exaggerating nor minimizing our own suffering, it's simply about seeing the suffering that's actually happening and acknowledging it for what it is. This keeps us from wallowing in self-pity, really mitigates against that. And in fact, operating from a base of genuine self-compassion lets us meet reality more directly and more honestly because we expand our capacity and resilience to handle more of life. We're able to turn honestly toward what's actually happening in this moment and meet it head on, rather than having to waste a bunch of time and energy trying to deny or ignore or bypass difficult things. So self-compassion in this way actually lets us become much more energetically efficient in our lives. And interestingly enough, self-compassion is shown in the research to lead to a greater sense of self-responsibility and more willingness to admit and apologize when we've made a mistake or been thoughtless or unkind. And that's because, again, when we trust that we have a consistently loving, supportive home base we can return to within ourselves after we've ventured out into the world, it doesn't feel so risky to own our mistakes, because we recognize that we're just human like everybody else, and that sometimes we mess up, sometimes we make mistakes. It's not that big a deal. This recognition of our own normal, messy humanness dissolves the shame that accrues from our inner critic's messaging that we're doing it wrong and that there must be something uniquely and irredeemably wrong with us. And it's also not by telling ourselves that we're so great. Self-compassion is actually about just seeing ourselves as the normal, complex human that we are. One last thing I wanted to note here is that, as you heard me allude to in my personal story a minute ago, moving from a home base of self-compassion, it doesn't necessarily create what might be perceived as super dramatic results when we're going through a tough time. Not necessarily. It more kind of neutralizes the shame and heaviness that comes from the unnecessary layer of self-criticism or self-doubt that our mind layers on top of the injury of the moment. It just lets things feel more okay, more manageable. So self-compassion is about just not adding unnecessary suffering on top of a painful moment, and about doing whatever we can in the moment to decrease rather than increase our own suffering. It's not about bypassing or fixing our way out of feeling bad. It's about supportively staying with ourselves as we're feeling bad until the difficult feelings start to dissipate naturally, which they do. So that's a bunch on the conceptual understanding side of self-compassion. But as with all of these embodiment practices we explore here together, no seedlings are able to really settle in and germinate toward genuine transformation within us until we practice and feel the ripple effects of them inside our own beings, inside our bodies. So I'd actually love to give you a firsthand experience of this right now. I'll invite you to clear away any distractions so we can really get present together for the next few minutes, and you can get a taste of what self-compassion feels like in real time in your own inner experience. This practice will probably be about 5 minutes or so, just for planning purposes for you. So with that, finding a comfortable seat and taking a few deep breaths to start to really arrive here, just kind of landing in the body. Just allowing the breath to move however it wants to move. It could be audibly, through the nose or the mouth, some movement in the body, whatever feels good. Allowing eyes maybe to drift closed, or softening the gaze down and out a few feet in front of you if you prefer. And now just first noticing how it is to reconnect to your body and breath in this moment. Now bringing in a sense of something you've been struggling with. And since we're just dipping a toe in today, starting small, no need to go with the heaviest, oldest pain in your life. Just bringing in something that's been feeling a little bit maybe challenging or annoying, agitating, frustrating recently to mind, and starting to tune into the sense of how hard this moment of struggle feels, particularly bringing awareness to where you're most palpably experiencing this sense of struggle or heaviness or annoyance or frustration in the body. Where do you notice this challenging feeling most in your body in this moment? You might notice if it has a sense of size or weight, shape, texture, or temperature. Just noticing the overall flavor of this struggle within you in this moment. And see if you can just allow this uncomfortable feeling to just be here, just as it is, just for these few moments, just gently meeting and greeting it. Not trying to fix or analyze it, just allowing it to be here, just as it is. And now saying to yourself, either internally or gently aloud, some words along the lines of, "Oof, this feels really hard." Or, "Ugh, this does not feel good." Maybe, being human is hard sometimes. This is a hard moment. And then turning toward the part of you that's struggling, the part that's feeling tender or scared, alone or vulnerable here in this pain, and asking what that part of you is needing right now. Just seeing what, if anything, bubbles up. And then we'll see if you can extend some of what's needed in this moment to that part of yourself through the warmth of your hands with some kind, gentle touch. That might be a hand over the heart or the belly, a gentle caress of the cheek, or a little hug around the shoulders, a little sway, or holding your own hand, one in the other. Just experimenting with bringing in a little soothing touch to the body, letting that warmth feel as good as you're able to let it feel, just being received into your being, some warmth and care and support. And then when you're ready, starting to invite in some comforting words of support that allow these parts of you to feel seen and held, feel safe, supported, repeating to yourself in a warm tone of phrase that feels soothing to you. Again, either internally or gently aloud, like, it's okay. It's okay, or I'm here with you. I've got you. I've got your back. Or we can handle this. And if it feels right, you might tack on a term of endearment. It's okay, honey. I'm here with you, sweetheart. It's gonna be okay, my love. And just noticing the effects of these kind words and affectionate gestures in your body, in your being. And taking a few last breaths to really soak in your own warmth and care here. And as you feel ready, allowing the eyes to reopen and returning your attention gently to the space around you. Welcome back. So this was a mini self-compassion practice. And this is a way that you can start practicing in your own life today. There's nothing more fancy or complicated to it than what we just did together here. This practice is a cumulative one. So we just rinse and repeat as often as we're able to when we notice we're having a tough moment in our days. Again, no moment is too small for this practice. We just walk through a process that I refer to with the acronym PATS. P for pause, A for acknowledge where you're suffering, T for touch, bringing in some soothing, regulating touch, and S for soothing words, extending yourself some supportive, reassuring words, which are, again, also regulating for your nervous system. So I also wanted to note that this may have felt quite lovely and nourishing for you, or this practice may have stirred up some agitation, resistance, cynicism, or a sense of numbing out. Please know that all of those responses to this practice are completely normal. It can take some practice for our systems to acclimate and get used to an inner environment of kindness if that's not what we've been experiencing for most of our lives, which most of us haven't been taught how to do toward ourselves. So trust that these practices are, again, cumulative. Just start where you are and trust that that's the perfect place to begin, always. And for this week, you might tune into micro moments of suffering you notice within yourself in your days, not so you feel victim to them or dwell in a counterproductively self-indulgent way, but quite the contrary, just so that you can start to pause and notice and acknowledge these little internal sticky spots and start to get curious about them and turn toward them, these contracted places, and breathe some kind oxygen in, some warm space around them. As always, start small and just see what you notice, and trust that every single moment in which you turn toward a hurting part of yourself with warmth and genuine curiosity, care, spaciousness, you're planting a seed that, if tended to consistently, can truly blossom into a beautiful garden over time. As always, I'd love to hear what you notice in the comments below.